These house slaves are expected to become these sexual objects.
In the house, you can pretty much command a slave to do anything. If you resist, you're risking death.
Prostitution, which was one of its stated goals. A whole wide range of sexual and romantic misadventures.
They were whipped, humiliated, and worked to death. Such was the life of a slave in ancient Greece. In Athens, slaves toiled endlessly in dangerous mines, where collapsing tunnels and toxic fumes made survival a daily battle.
No war for him.
Meanwhile, in Sparta, the slaves were trapped in a system of oppression, treated with ruthless cruelty to keep them under control. How did these people endure such terrible hardships? This is the harsh realities of slavery in ancient Greece. The reality of Greek slavery. They say freedom tastes sweet, but back in ancient Greece, freedom wasn't a treat everyone got to savor. Life for many was entirely different. For some, life wasn't even their own. Just walk into a bustling Greek city square back then, and you would see them, slaves blending into every corner of daily life. They were everywhere, serving in homes, sweating in the fields, hauling heavy loads on ships, or even making goods in workshops. The lives of these people were decided by forces beyond their control. But how did they end up in such a fate? In ancient Greece, there were many paths to becoming a slave. Some people were simply born into it, starting life as children of slaves, with no choice or chance of freedom from the beginning. But not everyone entered this life that way. Imagine a baby, just hours old, left alone on a hillside or at the city gates. Parents sometimes abandoned their babies this way, maybe because they couldn't afford to raise them or they didn't want them. If someone found that baby and decided to take it in, the child could be raised as a slave. Money, or the lack of it, played a role too. If a family was struggling, they might sell one of their children to survive. Daughters were often the ones sold because sons were needed to work the land or help around the house. And then there was the danger of simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Kidnapping was a constant threat. Pirates roamed the coast, ready to capture anyone they could sell. Bandits hid in the mountain passes, waiting to seize travelers. In this world, safety wasn't guaranteed. If you couldn't buy a slave, you might just steal one. This dark trade was as much a part of Greek society as any other business. The most common source of slaves, though, was war. When Greek armies clashed, the defeated side didn't just lose territory or pride, they lost their people. Victors would divide their prisoners into groups. Some would be lucky enough to be ransomed, returned to their families for a price. The others, however, would be marched to the market, sold as slaves to whoever could pay the price. Not every slave came from foreign lands or battles, though. Sometimes even a Greek citizen could end up in chains. If a farmer leased land and couldn't make payments, he could be forced into debt slavery, working off what he owed. For some, this was only temporary, a hard but manageable chapter in their lives. But for others, this debt slavery could last forever. In this so-called golden age of Greece, many lives were far from golden. Yet there is even more to uncover about what life looked like for men and women caught in this brutal system. Because, as you will see, the lives of slaves were anything but the same for all in different parts of Greece. Life as an Athenian slave. Athens wasn't just a city of philosophers, artists, and soldiers. Beneath the surface of its grand architecture and markets, it was also a city built on the labor of slaves. Historians estimate that Athens had as many as 80,000 slaves during the 6th and 5th centuries BC. That's almost as many people that lived in the entire city. An average Athenian household owned 3 or 4 slaves. However, poorer families owned none. Slaves in Athens were legally considered property, much like livestock or furniture. Masters could buy and sell them as they wished, and if a slave angered their master, they could be punished. Each slave's life depended entirely on the purpose they served and the mood of their owner. Household servants, for instance, often had some of the best conditions, if there is such a thing as good slavery. They were treated as close to family as a slave could be, joining in family rituals and celebrations, even participating in sacrifices. But this didn't mean they were truly part of the household. They couldn't use their own names. Their masters assigned them new ones. They weren't allowed to enter certain public places like the gymnasium or the public assembly. They weren't also allowed in the palaestrae, the wrestling schools where free citizens trained and prepared for athletic competitions. These places were meant only for those who were free, and slaves were forbidden from entering. Then there were the public slaves, those who belonged to the city-state itself. These slaves had a unique role, serving the city rather than a single master. They held a certain status, considered almost elite in the strange hierarchy of slavery. A few were able to buy their freedom eventually. Once freed, they would become metics or resident aliens. If they were lucky, they might even be granted citizenship someday. But for most slaves, freedom and citizenship were just dreams, far beyond reach. For slaves who worked in households, their tasks depended on their role and their gender. Male slaves often took care of shopping and other errands for the family. If a male slave worked independently, he was usually expected to make payments to his master periodically. A large number of male slaves worked in agriculture, handling the physically demanding work of tending crops and animals. Others labored in quarries or mines, where conditions were harsher. But that was a different world, and we will come back to it soon enough. Female slaves, on the other hand, handled the bulk of domestic work. They spent their days weaving wool, managing household chores, and even working in the shops around the Agora, Athens' lively public square. Some served as wet nurses, feeding infants of the family, while others helped raise the children, forming bonds that would never truly be recognized. However, the lives of female slaves often held even darker sides. As literal property of their owners, they were at the mercy of whatever temperament their master had, which could mean anything from fair treatment to constant abuse. Sexual abuse was common, with female slaves having little power to resist advances from the men in the household. Some were forced to work in brothels as prostitutes, while others lived as concubines, offering the master physical companionship without any of the rights of a wife. Concubines, too, had no claim to a stable life. Sometimes they lived in the man's house alongside his wife, though other times they were placed in a separate home. They might even raise their children there, children who would grow up as part of the master's household, but without any recognized status. At this point, one might wonder, could a slave at least find comfort in family life? The answer, unfortunately, was complicated. The dehumanization of Athenian slaves. Life for a slave in ancient Athens was tough and tightly controlled. Even the family connections they managed to build were fragile, always at risk of being torn apart. A slave might have a spouse and children, but these relationships meant little to the state. A master could separate family members at any moment, scattering loved ones without a second thought. Athenian law held little sympathy for slaves. They had almost no legal rights of their own and depended entirely on their masters to represent them in court. If a free person committed a minor crime, they might just pay a fine. But for a slave, the same act could lead to a lashing. The system even had a formula for this: 1 lash for each drachma of the fine. Punishment for them was physical, not financial. What is even worse is if someone needed a slave's testimony in court. They wouldn't just ask for it. No, they would force it out. People assumed slaves would protect their masters, so the only way to get a truthful testimony was through torture. A slave could be dragged in, tied to a rack and whipped until they said what was wanted, or maybe just anything to make the pain stop. Sometimes the torture pushed slaves to the edge, even costing their lives. They weren't really after justice here, they just wanted answers, no matter how they got them. Yet there were strange rules to limit cruelty. If a slave was badly mistreated, the master could actually sue for damages. And if an owner went too far, any citizen could prosecute them. This wasn't done out of kindness to the slaves. Instead, it was a way to prevent extreme violence in society. Oddly, some slaves could save enough money to buy their freedom. They couldn't own property, but sometimes their masters allowed them to run small businesses, as long as they paid a fixed fee. Records show that some slaves managed these businesses on their own, keeping part of their earnings. With enough time and patience, a handful of slaves scraped together enough money to earn their way out. In their daily lives, slaves also faced strict social rules. For instance, the slave men couldn't pursue romantic relationships with free boys, which was a form of connection allowed among the citizens at the time. The penalty was 50 lashes in public if they were caught. It was another barrier that set slaves apart from free people, even in personal matters. Life in Athens wasn't kind to slaves. They were constantly reminded of what they couldn't do, where they couldn't go, and the rights they would never have. But some places were even worse than this. For certain slaves, there were darker, deadlier paths waiting. The mines of despair. In ancient Greece, the mines held both treasure and terror. Huge sums of money poured in from silver, lead, and other minerals, but digging it out came at a high cost. Deep down in the tunnels, there was no sunlight, no fresh air, and there was danger in every shadow. The Athenians knew the risks of the job, so it made sense to send slaves into these dark, deadly places, sparing their own citizens the misery. And there were plenty of slaves too. Estimates say between 10,000 and 30,000 worked in the mining district of southern Attica during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. These slaves weren't just handed off to the mines. They were leased, like rented tools, by their owners to the mine operators. Some wealthy men, like the politician and general Nicias, made fortunes from this trade. He had about 1,000 slaves working the mines, and this investment earned him 10 talents a year. That's around a 33% return. The mines kept his pockets full, but at the price of countless lives. Life for a mining slave was harsh, to say the least. Many of these slaves worked deep underground, shackled to prevent escape. In the darkness, they were cut off from sunlight and fresh air, surrounded by the damp and the chill of the earth. The ventilation was poor, and the air was thick with dust and the smell of damp rock. Breathing itself could feel like a struggle. Worse yet, there was always the fear that at any moment the shaft might collapse. A single tremor and the ceiling above could come crashing down. On top of these dangers, the slaves faced the relentless demands of overseers, who made sure they worked until they had nothing left to give. Overseers, often slaves themselves, were considered more valuable than the miners they guarded. These overseers had to make sure production stayed high, so they drove the workers hard. Hours dragged on without breaks, and it wasn't uncommon for some miners to collapse from exhaustion, their bodies pushed past the limit. Many never made it out of the mines alive, and for those who did, it was still a life barely worth calling a life. The dangers didn't stop at accidents and exhaustion. In 413 BC, an Athenian army met disaster on an expedition to Sicily. Captured by the Syracusans, 7,000 Athenian prisoners were sent to work in the quarries there. Each one of them was forced into hard labor, and not a single man survived. The mines and quarries were places of no return, a death sentence for those unlucky enough to be thrown into them. It's hard to imagine the daily hardships these slaves faced. Every day they woke up to darkness, not knowing if they would live to see another sunset. To say they endured extreme hardship would almost be an understatement. Yet in other parts of Greece, slaves faced struggles that were different but no less harsh. Now it's time for today's subscribers pick. The image we are looking at today gives us a glimpse into the world of ancient Greece, where slavery was a harsh reality for many. The scene shows women dressed in simple clothing, restrained by chains, and standing before an older man. His seated position and outstretched hand suggest he might be inspecting or possibly purchasing the enslaved women. Their expressions and the very setup of the scene all create a story of control and helplessness. The harsh realities of slavery in ancient Greece are brought to life vividly here. Slavery wasn't just physical labor, it was about owning people's lives, controlling them as property, and disregarding their rights and freedom. Most of these enslaved people were captured in wars or born into slavery. For the women in particular, life as a slave could mean facing severe hardships, from working endlessly to having their personal lives entirely controlled. Looking at this image, how does it make you feel about life in ancient Greece? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Now let's step away from Athens and take a hard look at life in Sparta. The Helots. Critias, an ancient philosopher and poet, once remarked that the free in Sparta were more free than anywhere else, while the slaves were more fully slaves. His words weren't just a poetic line, they hinted at the brutal reality of Spartan life. In Sparta, slaves were called helots. The enslaved people in Sparta didn't belong to individual masters. They were owned by the state. The Spartans treated them more like enemies than workers. Helots had to wear distinct, humiliating clothes to mark them as different. as if the Spartans wanted everyone to know exactly where they stood. Even today, people in Greece still use the word helot to describe someone who labors in terrible conditions for almost nothing. What is astonishing is how outnumbered the Spartans were by these helots. For every Spartan, there were roughly 20 helots. They were everywhere, working hard to support the economy of the state. In fact, Spartan life depended entirely on their labor. The food the Spartans ate, the economy that kept their city-state running, all of it was built on the backs of the helots. Each Spartan family was given a piece of land, known as a kleros by the state. But unlike in Athens, where a family might work their land, in Sparta, that job was left to the helots. Spartan men spent their lives training for war, practicing sports, hunting, or engaging in politics. They didn't do farm work. That was beneath them. Instead, they had the helots laboring in the fields, planting, tending, and harvesting. The helots' work didn't just feed individual Spartan families. Their harvest also contributed to communal meals, which was an essential part of Spartan society. These were gatherings where the citizens bonded and shared in Spartan culture. And the helots, though invisible and unacknowledged, were the ones making it possible. In return for their hard work, helots were allowed to keep a small part of what they grew. But the majority went straight to the Spartans. This arrangement was efficient for the Spartans, as they reaped the rewards without lifting a finger. But for the helots, it was a life of inequality and endless labor, with little to call their own. This system allowed Spartans to focus on war, making them fierce fighters and keeping their city strong. Yet beneath the surface, there was a world of hardship and deep inequality. The helots knew their place in this society, and the Spartans made sure they remembered it. But Sparta's way of control didn't stop with humiliation. The city-state had even darker ways to keep the helots in line. Tools, not people. The Spartans didn't just control the helots, they crushed them. To the Spartans, helots weren't people, they were tools. The Spartans made it clear that helots belonged to the land they worked and to the Spartans who commanded them. They were beaten in public, not for disobedience or rebellion, but as a reminder. The Spartans used these beatings like a twisted ceremony just to show the helots who was in charge. And if that wasn't enough, Spartans even forced the helots to get drunk. The reason for this was to show the young Spartans what could happen if they drank too much. They were taught to mock and belittle the helots in this state, using their suffering to make a point. It was another way to keep them submissive and broken. As brutal as all this was, there was something even much more terrible. Killing a helot wasn't a crime in Sparta. Helots had no protection, no laws to keep them safe from violence. In fact, young Spartan men were encouraged to kill helots. Armed with daggers, these young men would travel through the countryside, murdering helots at random. It was a way to strike fear, to keep the helots in check, to make sure they knew the price of stepping out of line. The system was ruthless, but in a twisted way, clever. Spartans knew they were heavily outnumbered by helots, who did all the work for the state. But the thought of that many enslaved people living just a stone's throw away made them nervous. They couldn't ignore the potential for revolt. And so they created something called the Crypteia. Every year, young Spartan men who had finished their training would officially declare war on the helots. They were sent out with a single mission: kill as many helots as they could. And who did they target? The strongest, the healthiest, the most able-bodied helots. This was a calculated effort to keep the population weak and disorganized. By killing the strongest, the Spartans ensured that no leader or hero among the helots could emerge. Helot revolts did happen from time to time. With such a massive, oppressed group, how could they not? But these revolts were crushed every time. Sometimes, helots would betray their Spartan masters and help invading armies, or they would try to raid small territories. Yet no matter how hard they tried, the helots could never achieve true freedom. The Spartans had perfected their method of control. It was a system built on violence and terror. Every beating, every killing, every act of humiliation worked to keep the helots down, to make sure they stayed submissive. To the Spartans, it was all necessary, to keep themselves safe, to keep their society running. But there was another side to this harsh rule, a side not everyone would expect. The helots' strange role in Spartan warfare. Helots weren't just farmers or laborers to the Spartans, they played a much deeper, stranger role in Spartan society. Sure, by day they were out in the fields, planting and harvesting to feed the state, but their work didn't end there. When war came, the Helots were dragged along, but not as equal soldiers fighting beside their Spartan overlords. No, their role was far from glorious. They were forced into these strange support roles, carrying armor, fetching supplies, sometimes tossed into battle as lightly armed fighters, left to fill in the gaps. For the Helots, military service was like being thrown into a cage with no way out. One wrong step, and it could mean their lives. Yet, oddly enough, some Helots saw this as a tiny flicker of hope. Every so often, a Helot who proved himself in battle could earn his freedom. It wasn't common. It was like winning the lottery. Still, the faintest chance kept some of them holding on. But there was a method to this madness. The Spartans weren't inviting Helots to war out of any sense of kindness. They knew deep down that they were outnumbered by the Helots and that too much freedom or power given to them could backfire. The Spartans were no fools. They understood that if the Helots grew too confident, it could mean an uprising. But if they kept the Helots under strict control, they would risk morale crumbling entirely. And this would turn the Helots from reluctant allies into resentful workers who were even more likely to resist. So the Spartans used a mix of rewards and punishments to keep the Helots in line. Occasionally, they would give them spoils from war or promise freedom for exceptional service. These were the rare exceptions that kept the Helots motivated, but even these rewards came with heavy strings attached. If a Helot didn't perform well, there were severe consequences. Spartans had no problem using violence, and there was always the looming threat of the Crypteia, the secret police, dedicated to keeping the Helots from ever rising up. The Helots were caught in this strange, uncomfortable space. Needed, but not wanted. Feared, but never fully trusted. They spent their days working under the sun and their nights haunted by the knowledge that freedom was always just out of reach. Every little reward was carefully calculated to keep them in line without ever giving them real power. And the truth is, there was even more to the story. The Helots weren't just a source of labor, they were seen as something much more useful. Let's just say the Spartans had some rather disturbing ideas on how to grow their numbers, and it involved the Helots in ways they couldn't refuse. Bloodlines of bondage. The Helots were slaves, yes, but they weren't like other slaves in ancient Greece. Unlike in Athens, where slaves had no family or community of their own, Helots did. They had families, they formed communities. It was part of Spartan control to allow this. Keeping the Helot population steady was important. And to do that, Spartans encouraged them to have children, to keep the family lines going. But it was never as simple as that. There was something darker to it, a twisted take on what family meant for the Helots. Just like they bred and trained their warriors, the Spartans didn't leave Helot families entirely alone. Strong Helots were allowed to survive and pass on their strength. Weak ones, they weren't allowed the same chance. They might be thrown aside, or in some cases even killed on the spot. It was survival of the strongest, not for glory, but for control. And it didn't stop there. The Spartans had other ways to build up the Helot population, ways that might make you shudder. Some Spartan men would have children with Helot women, not because they wanted to be fathers or partners, but to swell the ranks of their servants. These children, called nothoi, were left somewhere in between freedom and servitude. They weren't true Spartans, but they weren't quite slaves either. They lived in this strange middle place, allowed to join the citizen army or work low-level public jobs, but never seen as equals. Girls born from these unions faced an even harsher fate. Unlike boys, they weren't allowed any role or purpose in the state structure. They were simply discarded. In the end, whether it was the harsh treatment of Athens' slaves or the calculated cruelty of Sparta, the system of slavery in ancient Greece was built on power, control, and dehumanization. It's a dark part of history that shows just how far societies will go to maintain their grip on power, and how little value they place on human lives in the process. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.